so much. Thank you, Callie. It's so great to be with everybody here today. Thank you so much for having me. This is the second time that I get to talk with you all at CSB, and I really, really appreciate the opportunity to share this work with you. So thank you for taking the time and for joining me today. I just want to share my screen real quick so we can look at visuals. Can you all see my screen? Can I get a thumbs up? Great. So as Kelly mentioned, please drop your questions in the chat and I will take them at the end, and I will keep an eye on them. If something urgent happens that we need to address, then also feel free to share it in the chat as well. I am, it's very, I'm trying to think about the emotions on a day like today, like the wide scale of emotions that I have about the fact that today is November 4th, and it is actually 30 years since Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated, since I still remember everything about that evening. I was 2 years old. No, I'm kidding. I was in high school actually, and I remember what was happening in the streets of Tel Aviv when that had happened. I remember everything about the days after. And I remember this is the watershed moment in contemporary Israel. It felt at the time, and in some ways it still feels that way until today, as a point of no return. So I've been mulling those moments in my head ever since. And as my academic career developed and as my research into photography deepened, I realized that the moments after the murder and how it was depicted in the media and how it unfolded in our streets, those moments are always there. So I greatly appreciate this opportunity to share some thoughts about visual culture, photography, and media in this context with you today. And I'm grateful for the space to look back at these images and these works, and hopefully to closely examine what impact did that trauma had on visual storytellers and specifically photographers in the immediacy of the aftermath. So today I would like to show you works by Israeli artists alongside press images and images that depict Israel's growth as a nation, to talk about the relationships between those different times, different periods of times and practices, and see how in Israel they inform a particular point of view as well as its visual and media cultures. And I wanted to start with this image. You might be wondering why. I want you to look at the image that you all have on your screen now. And what you're seeing is a Prime Minister hailing a taxi outside of Tel Aviv's Cultural Center in 1991. His posture, he's looking for a taxi, feels so of the moment, feels so mundane, such a moment in time. He's standing alone by himself, seems completely isolated, not sure where to go, not sure how to turn. This image was taken by Miki Kratzman, who's a very well-known photographer. We'll come back to Miki Kratzman in a couple of moments. And that moment in time, 1991, was indeed a moment of a turning point, a moment of great changes that the region was undergoing. And here at this moment, it's obvious that the comparison between Rabin, the person, and Rabin, the political leader, is palpable. Where will he go and how will he get there seemed to have been a really important question at the time, and later on, of course, when he was prime minister, working toward reconfiguring the region and driving the region toward peace. So I do want to share a little bit of a trigger warning. We are going to be looking at some images that have a little bit more challenging content. I won't spend much time with them, but I do want you to see them because they, I think, really expose many critical things about what did it feel like to be in that place at that moment in time. So I'm going to share them with you, not to think just about their content, but also about how the photographer was operating, how the images were seen, and why. And part of my point here is that this moment in time was a moment of great transformation for Israeli society, to be sure, but also for Israeli media and its visual storytellers. And that watershed moment also tells a story about Israeli visual storytelling and specifically photography. So we will see how public spaces were key to the ways in which artists responded to the moment and how they negotiated the trauma by offering an alternative to official commemoration, insisting on maintaining the presence of the murder in local discourse, which seemed to have diminished responsibility from culprits and downplay the impact of the event in the years since. So we'll also think about what is documentary photography, and what are some of the problems that might arise from our relationship with documentary photography. What do I mean by that? I just want to set the stage about that before I move on. Documentary photography, we tend to think about it as a direct depiction of something that happened in front of the lens, and we kind of assume a truth value to the image when we think about documentary photography. But I want to be cautious in how we're thinking about documentary photography, and I want to suggest that we can think about it maybe in a more expanded kind of way, where documentary photography, each photograph always involves a series of choices made by the photographer, and later on, whether it's in magazines, so maybe they're editors or other avenues where the image would have been seen by the public. There are always choices involved, and there's always a particular point of view through which to think about photographs. And I'll try and talk a little bit about that as we look through images. So that's the path that we're going to be walking on today. And remember, I'm going to show you now a couple of images that are a little bit, I know they're sensitive, but I do want to make sure that we look at them as well, and I won't spend too much time with them. And these images are really, really important for the story that we're going to be telling now. On October 19, 1994, a suicide bomber exploded bus line number 5 with a bomb made by Hamas's Ichye Ayash with 20 kilos worth of explosive. The bombing happened at the heart of bustling Tel Aviv, at the center of the city, moments after 9 a.m. on a work week. I still remember the sound of the loud bang. I was supposed to be there to take my bus to school from the same stop, but I was running late that morning. 22 people were murdered, over 100 were injured, and it was the most destructive suicide bombing in Israel by that time. It also marked, remember how I said earlier, a watershed moment. So this one was also a watershed moment, but this time we're thinking about the media, since it was the first time TV and newspaper editors had to make decisions about the scope of coverage. TV cameras and photographers were quick to arrive at the scene, but family members discovered their loved ones were hurt by watching the news. The bombing led to redefining ethical codes around coverage of such mass tragedies, and unfortunately, from that moment on, such decisions were indeed very much needed, and they happened almost on a daily basis. Here I'm showing you a photograph by photojournalist Ziv Kuren of the bus in the moment following the explosion, and this image, I think, captures the silent horror. It's the moment after the loud bang had already ended. This is the moment where we see the injured people, the mangled bus, the city street from above, electricity wires parallel to the remnants of the bus. We see the glass, the wreckage, shuttered hopes for peace and coexistence. It was considered too sensitive to be published in Israel, but quickly made its way to the front page of the New York Times, reflecting the impossibility of the day-to-day life in the region. This was a photograph of a moment that was about to become almost a daily reality. The image also reflects something bigger that concerns the role of photojournalism in Israel and its relationship with the ways in which it processes disasters and conflicts. gives shape to the unimaginable. It gives shape to processes that seem ungraspable to the local collective consciousness, defining it as inseparable from trauma and strife. Photojournalism in Israel is interwoven with the shaping of national identity and with the disintegration of this identity, with the rise of extremists to parliament and blatant attempts to overhaul the democratic system. All of those things connect. We're in the aftermath of what happened after those suicide bombings, and a tumultuous year followed, during which the then Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin was pushing forward toward finalizing peace accords that will lead to regional stability, while terrorist groups from both Palestinian and the far-right terrorist circles of Israeli politics were doing whatever they could to make sure peace will not become a fact of life. And here I'm just showing you some of what was very visible in local media and traditional legacy media around those protests and around the objection to what Rabin was trying to do at the time. So I want to turn your attention. I think you guys can probably see my cursor, right, where I'm pointing at with my arrow. Here it says in Hebrew, just in case you don't read Hebrew and that the quality of the images might be problematic, this says the government of betrayal, the Hellenistic, rise up the Maccabees. And the demonstration is a demonstration of Likud supporters and right-wing supporters against the acts of the Israeli government at the time. And what we have here, I just want you to think about the use of those terms, the Hellenistic, the Maccabees. What we have here is the exhumation of a biblical tale to tie this moment to a heroic imagined past, meaning the Maccabees are the people that see themselves as having the duty to stop what the government is doing. The government is associated with the Hellenistic, meaning the Jewish people that adopted Greek culture during the days of the Second Temple, and were in opposition to the Maccabees. That's the language. That's the level of the symbolic struggle over the soul of a nation that was articulated in those spaces at that time. What I'm showing you here is an image that we'll see again in just a moment. This was published in the newspaper, and in case you're wondering, it's a picture of Yitzhak Rabin shown as an SS soldier, which was how his portrait was circulating around the radical extreme right-wing circles at the time. And the title underneath says, supporters of Kach and the radical right wing were praying for the death of Rabin. Very violent, very aggressive. The ultimate delegitimization to show the leader of the Jewish state as an SS soldier is the ultimate act of denouncing him. And let's just say that images matter, right? And the ways in which someone is portrayed indicates something about their legitimacy. To be shown like a Nazi in Israeli society means you are the biggest enemy that can be, that you are the devil and also less than human. Combine that with the title underneath that I've just shared with you. So when these images find their way into the media where they disconnect from the context of right-wing extreme radical activity and find their way into the heart of the establishment, from the depth of underground political streams and a pre-social media environment, pre-internet world, they move from the darkness of the underground to the heart of public discourse. And seen in this way, these are read like a very clear threat. And they were understood at the time as violent hallucinations by maniacs. They were working at a distance from the mainstream, but a real threat was already looming. And I think we should note something about that threat. A month before Rabin was assassinated, protesters in Jerusalem's Kikar Tzion yelled things like Rabin is a traitor, death to Rabin, and I'm quoting and trying to translate somehow, with blood, with fire, we will expel Rabin. There were massive signs with the words death to the archive murderer placard on a balcony you're seeing here, where Bibi Netanyahu is standing and was giving a speech at the time. Militants from the radical right-wing terror organization Kach were proudly stating to the press, here I'm showing you this, this image, and they're talking about how they got close enough to Rabin's car to steal his car's emblem. And if you recognize this young person, it's because this is Itamar Ben-Gvir, Israel's current Minister of National Security. The language of the incitement that you're seeing here, visually and rhetorically, leaned on Jewish mythology and ritual. It was twisted for political purposes, demarcating a distinction between right-wing, conservative, religious nationalists and the left, portrayed as traitors who were willing to give up the land, the Holy Land, the biblical Holy Land, to serve political goals. I just want to say one more thing about this images on the bottom. They are carrying a casket, and the sign here says, return security to the nation, Halikud. This is Bibi Netanyahu leading that group of people. Rabbis at the time were performing rituals called Pulsa de Nura, praying for the death of Rabin, utilizing ancient Jewish mythology and Kabbalistic rituals in order to hasten his death. As I'm certain you're all aware, while religious leaders were approving the murder of a prime minister who was working against their ideology, a young man named Igal Amir was about to make their wishes come true. And we will come back to how that moment was recorded by artists later on. But for now, I wanted to show you the image that was ingrained in cultural memory, a grainy screenshot of the moment of the murder from a video documentation of a non-affiliated videographer who was present at the scene at the time, and how that moment was then captured and maintained as a mural, which is what you're seeing here on the right, as an expression of that moment in the public space. And I want to say something that is a little bit more theoretical, and introduce a term that I'm thinking about when I'm looking at these images and when I'm processing what was happening in visual culture at the time. I'm thinking about a French theorist named Maurice Blanchot, who defined the idea of the disaster as what does not touch anyone in particular. The I, Blanchot wrote, is not threatened by the disaster that remains exterior. The disaster remains out of reach. The disaster, to quote Blanchot, is always already past, and yet we're on the edge or under the threat, all formulations which would imply the future, that which is yet to come. In that sense, the future belongs to the disaster, and for Blanchot, we are destined to it in the same way we are destined to what he refers to as a law we cannot change, what he called an uncodifiable law. And I think this is particularly relevant for the ways in which Israeli photojournalists and documentarians articulated the capturing of daily lives in the region, starting with the first half of the 20th century, during which they were chronicling a state that was on the verge of materializing, on the verge of declaring independence, a state that was working in future tense, that was always in a condition of becoming. So here I'm showing you this image by Zoltan Kluger of refugees from Buchenwald who were making their way to pre-state Palestine, an image that was captured in the photographic archive of the Jewish National Fund. And the reason why I wanted to show you this image is because I think it speaks in a really interesting way to those meeting points that I've mentioned earlier between specific perspectives and our expectations of documentary photography. This is obviously a staged photograph, and many of the photographs that were preserved in the archives of Zionist organizations that became key to the ways in which Israel imagined itself, culturally speaking, were actually staged photographs. You're seeing the prisoners here wearing their prisoner clothes. They are standing in one group with the people that have rescued them, right? In this narrative, they are the people that have rescued them, the Zionist activists, the soldiers of the state that was in a condition of becoming, and they're all united under the flag. They're all looking toward the horizon. The group stands together in this triangular formation, looking toward the future that awaits them. And then I was thinking about this image by Itai Cohen that was featured in the national annual photojournalism competition in Israel, Local Testimony, or Edut Mekomit. This is an image from 2023, a year like no other in the very recent history of Israel. And I was thinking about how that flag felt as a signifier of pain and trauma and loss in 2023, and how it was seen as an emblem of hope in 1945. I'll also note that the Zionist photography in pre-state Palestine, and I think maybe some of you have heard me talk about that a few months ago, also as part of this series, it gave rise to a particular photographic point of view, which looks at the here and now, but sees it through the eyes of the future state and its civic space. Blanchot, just to go back to him for just a few more moments, and then I promise I won't say anything again about French theorists and how they were thinking about disasters. But part of the reason why I find him interesting and relevant to this is because he connects the disaster to a specific type of memory and forgetfulness, that of the immemorial. It's a type of an exterior remembrance related to what is always already past and always already be there. Although Blanchot considers photography, considers a disaster in relation to the written word, to literature, I argue this is where we can bring his thought to photography in relation to crisis and in relation to a disaster. And not to think about photography as an aid memoir, but as what touches our present experience, what confronts us with the forceful experience of the disaster that is always already rooted in a framework that needs to be cohered as such in order to decode its mechanism. Just showing you a couple more examples from early Zionist photography in the region. The Zionist laborers, the young men that are always shown working the land, utilizing tools of technology, advanced technology. They're always working in a barren land. It's always them isolated in the landscape, reaffirming the connection between the Jewish people and the Holy Land through the fruits of their labor. And then the Jewish soldier from 1941, a Jewish soldier that would have been this heroic figure that was standing in complete contrast to what was happening to Jewish people at the time in Europe. There was almost an internal contradiction between what was happening to people in Europe at the time, to Jewish people in Europe at the time, and how the Zionist establishment tried to articulate the figure of the Jewish soldier at the time. So photography is key to the ways in which we tell ourselves who we are as individuals and communities. And we think about photography as what bears witness or a trace of a moment that once took place. The camera sets the stage for this drama of the everyday to unfold. Just to show you a couple of more examples that were preserved in the archives of the Zionist organizations and have served as a foundation upon which the visual culture in Israel was founded. Again, young people dancing, celebrating in the fields. They're dancing the hora, and the fields are empty other than their presence there. And this young woman calling out into the world. I always think that she's calling her comrades, bringing them all together. These images were key to the ways in which Israeli society understood its past and also understood the role of people like Rabin, who was himself a Jewish soldier in pre-state Palestine, that was actively working to help set in place the Jewish state. So in my work, I tried to turn the camera and the images onto themselves, so to speak, to insist that they are not transparent, but actually hold important keys to understanding how do we capture the world and how the ways in which those images function impact how we see ourselves in the world around us. And my main point here is that photographic systems define points of views, and those point of views are key to the shaping of individual, collective, and national identities. And I just want you to look at the image here, and it's an image that I'm sure that many of you had seen many times in the past, the Declaration of Independence from May 5th, 1948. David Ben-Gurion is standing and reading the famous declaration. But I just want you to know the emblems around him and how this image was maintained. Above him is Herzl, the originator of the idea of the Jewish state, and the flag. So when Ben-Gurion stands here and gives this declaration, and we're seeing him from this angle from underneath, looking up toward the leaders of the new Jewish state, he also has the approval of Herzl above him and the presence of the flag next to him. In my research and writing over the last 2 decades, I noticed that the shaping of national identity in Israel has been intertwined with photographic representation, and specifically with a turn toward realism and documentary. But why? Why is it that photographic practice in Israel was dominated in such a way by documentarian approaches? This turn is embedded in regional histories and in the shaping of the Israeli national consciousness. So here, I want to spend a few moments talking a little bit about how I understand the nature of photographic images and how does that intersect with ideas around the disaster and how all of that plays into the shaping of national identity, or I should say, how does that play into the shaping of a national identity in crisis? The images show us, this image specifically shows us a moment of victory, of soldiers overwhelmed by what they just accomplished in less than 6 days. This will become an iconic moment in Israel, with citizens seeing themselves or aspire to be these soldiers. A writer named Simon Faulkner argued that lens-based media became dominant in representing Israel's conflicts. And this involvement, he says, stems from an approach that turns to photography as a mechanism of realism, as something that enables documentation, recording the real. Faulkner recognizes that this turn in the dominance of photojournalism defined media and visual arts in Israel. And although this dominance has a clear presence in Israeli media, I would argue against Faulkner's invocation of the turn to realism. In fact, I think this turn reflects an inherent crisis of national identity that was developed, recognized, and articulated by the turn to photography, an identity that defines itself as a visual image, as the visual image that it sought to implement in a given territory. And again, I wanted to turn to 2023, to the more recent past, and show you the images of a nation in crisis. These were unfolding in real time prior to the October 7 war. And in that sense, I'm thinking more about this person, Adam Baruch, the late renowned writer, editor, and artist. Baruch in 1986 suggests that documentary photography should be a crucial aspect of local culture. And I'm quoting him in my translation from the Hebrew. The obvious chance of young Israeli photography lies in journalism, in advertising. The schools can also be seen as an extension of the press, the art/chronicle, combining artistic and journalistic perceptions, is the main or the most effective area of activity available to emerging Israeli photography today. Baruch followed that statement by curating the second photography biennial in Israel, emphasizing the turn to documentary and the magazine, the editorial photography, as the favorable space for photographic practice. There was this push and pull between aesthetic and journalism, and it continued to inform the discourse around photography in Israel for the next few decades. And I'll just say briefly, and I don't want to spend too much time with this, that we can consider earlier photographic technologies such as the written photographic postcard or the carte de visite, and immediately turn to our smartphones and the never-ending stream of photographic apps, as well as visual and textual regiments, and how these have been part of how we're thinking about photography since the 19th century. I'm not taking you down that full road with me as the nerdy photo historian, don't you worry, but I just wanted you to see how documentary photography and how the capturing of a disaster and the aftermath of a disaster was key to the shaping of photography since the beginning. This is another moment, in a specific moment in American history that I thought will be of particular relevance for you guys. A moment that was characterized by a severe crisis in the shared language that was brought about by a political and economic emergency. So here I'm showing you an image that I'm sure that many of you are well familiar with. Dorothea Lange, migrant mother, from the 1930s. Remember how I said the documentary photography feels like something that is embedded within truth, but we should always consider it as something that involves a series of choices? So I just wanted to show you all the other images that Dorothea Lange took that day when she was capturing her migrant mother in California, and how this image was the image that was selected by her boss, Roy Stryker, and the image that became the most emblematic with that moment in time in American history. And I'm mentioning this in this context because these forms of documentation, or photographic documentation, the way photographs were used to articulate a national identity, were happening here in the US at the same time as they were happening in the Middle East. And photography was utilized in a similar way by the Zionist establishment at the time. So those things are always intertwined and reciprocal. And since the 1920s, Zionist organizations such as the Jewish National Fund, and here I'm showing you archival cards from the Jewish National Fund collections. The premise of the Jewish National Fund was to purchase lands in Palestine, in pre-state Palestine, to secure Jewish dominance. And they began structuring a photographic archive that was used for what they termed as international and local propaganda. And they were actively creating this archive since the fund had moved to Jerusalem during the 1920s. So all of those images were key to the ways in which national identity was shaped and formed. Armed with all of that knowledge that you now have about documentary photography and photojournalism in pre-state Palestine and Israel, I now want to go back to the 1990s and to the evening of November 4, 1995, that marks a crucial point in Israel's recent history. After a peace rally held at Malchei Israel Square, Kings of Israel, later to be renamed Rabin Square, in the heart of Tel Aviv, at the foot of the municipality's building, Prime Minister and leader of the Avodah Party, Yitzhak Rabin, was gunned 3 times at close range. Rabin was taken to a nearby hospital where he was pronounced dead. 100,000 citizens were attending the rally that night, demonstrating their support of the Oslo Accords and Rabin's attempt to pave a way for regional peace. Rabin's assailant, Yigal Amir, was a Jewish religious nationalist that was determined to derail the peace process Rabin had undertaken. He was a law student from Bar Ilan University, and he was immediately captured and taken into custody. The media was present at the scene, and they aired the documentation of the murder again and again. Here I'm showing you an image from the reconstruction of the murder. Amir is seen approaching Rabin in a crowded parking lot right off the bustling Ibn Gviro street, firing and then being tackled to the ground by security guards. There were gunshots, there was chaotic movements, there were screams, video and stills camera of independent photographers and broadcast channels shared visual information from numerous angles. In the first hours following the event, it became apparent that the shock felt in Israeli society was affected not only by the first assassination of a prime minister in Israel, but also by the fact that the assassin was Jewish, acting in the name of religious beliefs. Although the murder triggered immediate local and international artistic responses, research of its ramification was actually quite limited in the first decade after the murder. And current attempts to study the first years of Israeli art following Rabin's murder reveal social conflicts, contradictions of identity, and a conflation of public spaces and private existence. And here I'm just showing you some of the moments that became so associated with that moment and how it was understood in the aftermath. I want you to note that sticker with the date above the candles. This says, "We will never forgive and will never forget. Remember the murder of Rabin," of the youth organization Hanor Omed. All of those images were prevalent in public spaces in the days that followed. So I want to start with this image and with this project by Miki Kratzman, whom I've already mentioned. A project that he had done with Eldad Rafaeli and Shai Moshe. It's called The Day After. And I wanted to start here because a lot of the projects that we will consider were characterized by the turn to the street and specifically a turn to the space where the murder had happened. What you're seeing here is a wall that was right across from where Rabin was murdered in the back of the municipal building in Tel Aviv. And there's perhaps a shift here from enclosed spaces to public spaces as a way to contend with the loss and contend with what had happened. Miki Kratzman, known for his long-time commitment to document Israeli activity in the occupied territories, created in that moment of civic chaos a photographic project that became representative of the first days within Israeli society following the murder. Together with Rafaeli and Moshe, Kratzman returned each night to the square to hang photographs on the already dense walls that were covered in graffiti and handwritten messages. Here it says, "Slicha," sorry. And the word slicha that was spray painted here in blue letters is slicha from the people toward Rabin. That was the type of graffiti that was covering the walls at the time. So they focused on this wall and they hung photographs there every night. And they would wait to see reactions from passerby. And they wanted to see if passerby will tear the image of Rabin from the wall. Will they write over them? How would people would react to the moment? And then they would document the traces of the reactions left on the wall. And in that sense, the work uses images as an opening point for a gesture, for an action in time, for an ephemeral action, while the surrounding becomes the visual frame. The wall and the images are then joined into a multi-layered piece that can only take place at the site of the murder, as it can only be fully seen in the context of the site itself. So we have the photographs, we have the actions of the people, we have this performance around the images, and all of this is captured in one singular frame. Kratzman said in an interview with researcher Professor Dana Ariely, "We named the series the day after as we assumed that something happened to us. When we placed the next layer, there were things that remained and poked out." Think about that in relation to how you were thinking about identity and someone's psyche in relation to trauma. Kratzman himself, as I've mentioned, a very well-known documentarian, and in a conversation between Kratzman and Simon Faulkner, Kratzman discusses the dichotomy of visibility and invisibility exposed by gestures of anonymous masses. Photos of Rabin were left intact, while photos of the recently then elected Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu were corrupted. And I wanted you to see what was he documenting in the days before the murder. So these are Likud supporters, and they're demonstrating at Moshe Junction. You can see this person wearing a keffiyeh, equating Rabin, who's also featured here with a keffiyeh, and this says, "The liar, elections now." I wanted to show you another project that Kratzman was working on at the time. He collaborated with artist Boaz Arad to create the video work 9:40 p.m., the time of the murder, in which they asked passerby to recreate what they remember of the moment of the murder as it was broadcasted on TV. Our national memory, as articulated by the news, is then absorbed onto the site as everyday routines take over the trauma. It was created a decade, I want you to know that, almost a decade after the murder, and the video plays on the fragmentary nature of our memory and the presence of the murder as a monument, a site of remembrance that functions to substantiate a particular narrative. Kratzman, I should also note, just before I move on to this, I should also know that Kratzman is an internationally recognized photo-based artist and documentarian whose works have been shown in places like the Pompidou. He's recently working on, in the past few years, he's been working on his own archive of works, and he has ongoing projects with various collaborators that think about the documentation of Israel and the Middle East, trying to actively uncover some of the problematic actions of the Israeli government over the past few decades. With that, I want to say something about Dana Ariely, who noted that the first sign, I'm quoting her, in the rise of a dictatorship is a political assassination, all the more so when a presiding prime minister is murdered. That was part of the motivation that she felt at the time to group artists and respond to what was happening around her in real time. So in 2005, a decade after the murder, she published this book, Creators in Overburden, Rabin's Assassination in Art and Politics. This also became an exhibition. And I wanted to show you some of the artists that were included in that book and some of the works that they were producing at the time. So here I'm showing you a piece, a detail from an installation view by Uri Lifshitz, who was a controversial and an influential artist who passed away in 2011. In 2023, his widow shared in an interview that they were friends with the Rabins, with Yitzhak and Leah Rabin, and also with right-wing prime ministers such as the Sharon family. Lifshitz responded physically. He had a physical reaction that night that Rabin was murdered, and he nearly collapsed. In the aftermath, he created this series of works that actually chronicle Margalit Har-Shefi. She's another character in the story of the assassination. She was a student that was associated with Yigal Amir, and she was convicted after the murder for not preventing it. It was only the second time in the history of Israel that someone was convicted for that offense. Her punishment was later commuted, and she was in jail for only 5 months in 2001. She argued that she stopped having any communication with Yigal Amir once she realized that he was going down a very dangerous path. And in this work, Lifshitz portrays her as a key presence in the murder, not to mention the sort of a femme fatale. I'm showing you here a sculpture by Moti Mizrahi, who won a Lifetime Achievement Award by the Israeli government in 2024. I want you to note this homage to Yitzhak Rabin, this exterior that seems damaged, that seemed to be in pain. And then I want to show you this type of a response from artist Ganit Berst. And what you're seeing here is a newspaper. It's a page from Haaretz newspaper from the day before the murder. And here, actually, on the bottom, there's an invitation to the peace rally from the political movement Shalom Achshav, Peace Now. And there's also an essay here about the problematic relationship between Rabin and Shimon Peres, who was running to replace Rabin after the murder and lost to Bibi Netanyahu. And the words here say, an old man dressed in a suit, a very old man, his face white as snow. These words are the words that the doctor that admitted Rabin to the hospital that night was saying, as he could not even recognize who is this person that he was looking at. So Best takes the words from that evening and she places them on the newspaper from the day before, overlaying these words. And it's a meeting point between the day before and the day after, the premonition and the aftermath. I'm showing you this piece now. I'm moving forward in time to 2015, 2 decades after the murder. This is a poster by Shimon Zenthaus, who was the head of the graphics department in Bezalel, and he presents this massive photograph of Benjamin Netanyahu smiling. His smile reminds or is meant to echo the smile of Yigal Amir. When Yigal Amir was on trial, there was a lot of talks in the media about how he's constantly smiling. And behind Bibi's head, you see how the light gives him this erratic depiction. And on the dash here, the sticker, "Goodbye, friend," I'll come back to that in a moment, is placard as well. At the time, Professor Ariely organized an exhibition of works that responded to the murder in the aftermath of 2 decades. This was one of the images that was included in that show. And Ariely argued that Israeli society was experiencing amnesia when it came to the murder. An amnesia that was part of a necessary survival mechanism, but also the problematic result of a political system. So here's the sticker. And I think we should note something about the sticker. Shalom chaver, goodbye friends. The words came from the speech that Bill Clinton was given that was actually written by Anthony Blinken. And it became a sticker that all of Israel received with the newspaper and the days that followed the murder. It was it was featured in public spaces all over. And you know, these were the days of the bumper sticker, right? We still didn't have social media. And this was a way for private people to demonstrate their beliefs and, you know, their position in the world. After a year, the sticker had changed to Chaver ata chaser, friend, we miss you. And it also began appearing in popular music. And those who opposed him, let me see if I have an image of that here. Oh, those who opposed him were featuring stickers that said, "It's all because of you, Chaver." So this became like a really well-known fixture in public spaces. Here I'm showing you works by artist Nir Hod. This is Orthodox Suicide from 1995, an oil on canvas. It was actually censored when it appeared in Haifa Museum in 1995, and it reemerged in the exhibition after 20 years. It was curated by Professor Arieli. This is another piece by Nir Hod, he's really well known for this seductive, appealing portraiture of people, and he developed a visual language that is really associated with him. And then he's using that language that is all about the beauty and the seductive quality of portraiture to talk about themes like Orthodox suicide. Of course, it's a reference to Yigal Amir and Rabin's murder. David Takover, a very well-known graphic designer, created, I'll just show you a couple more images and then I'll close it up to see if you guys have any questions. Lo nishkach v'lo nislach, November 4, 1995, we will not forget and we will not forgive. And a poster that clearly targeted Bibi Netanyahu, who was seen at the time as partially responsible for the murder. And in the aftermath, 20 years later, Takover returned to that poster and erased the words Lo nishkach v'lo nislach, signifying how it felt as though the murder was being forgotten from Israeli political life. Michal Sahar, designer Michal Sahar, created a similar image, but here she kept nishkach and nislach, will forget and forgive. And I just wanted to end with this image of the scar by the duo Glendon and Isabella. In case you're not sure what you're looking at, it's because TVs don't really look like that anymore, but this is a TV shooting a bullet straight into Israeli's heart. And I think we all felt that way during that day, and we've all felt that way for many, many days after. And they captured the mundane existence of Israelis in front of the TV. They were just sitting there to watch the political rally, and how they were forever changed by that night. So I want to thank you so much for allowing me to have this time with you. There's so much more to share about those days and the photographic representation of the murder and its aftermath in Israeli visual culture and memory. But I think this is all the time that we have for now. And if there are any questions, I'll be more than happy to take them now.
Great. Well, I'll start with a few questions. Can you talk a little bit about, you mentioned several times images that were not shown in Israel or that were censored in Israel, but did make it internationally.
Mm-hmm.
How did that affect the international response versus the response in Israel to Rabin's murder?
Yeah. So the images that I've mentioned that were that found their way to the New York Times were more of the suicide bombings specifically. And whereas in Israel, there was a concern about showing them in the newspaper because it was so raw, and it was a decision that had to be made by editors in local newspapers. The same could not be said for people in the US at the time, right? It was at a distance from Israel where these images could have been seen, and we're in a pre-internet environment where, if something is featured in the New York Times, no one's going to know about it in Israel unless they'll make a lot of efforts to find that newspaper. And I think it tells us something about the media environment of the time. And just to say those words almost feels like a remnant of something that no longer functions in this way. Can you imagine now that an image will be posted by the New York Times, not published, posted online, and not have it reverberate across the world. But I'll also say that in real time, it made it very clear to the world that the conflict between Israel and Hamas was boiling, and it was transforming the region forever, and it claims the lives of innocent civilians. And I wish I could say that it was the last time that that was seen in this way.
How do you feel like the assassination affected your generation specifically as you sort of came of age?
Oh, we're still figuring it out. I'm serious. It was the most defining trauma of our young lives, and it came at the heels of the Gulf War that happened in 1991, that came on the heels of the Intifada in the late 1980s, that began in 1986. So we grew up into this reality, and it was a moment that broke all of us. Many of us believed in the peace process. Many of us were there at the peace rally that night. Like, we saw that moment as a moment of hope that was felt for the first time in many decades. And we've never had that hope again. Never. As a generation, now as parents, as the people that are thinking about the future of their children in Israel, we've lost the hope, and we have not really able to gain it ever since.
Okay.
Deep, heavy.
Yes.
Sorry.
I also want to ask about, what do you think in a world, like you said, where social media, we can get a million articles, posts, pictures, posts at any time? What is the responsibility of the media now to
Mhm.
document objective truth versus presenting a point of view or a story or something
Bigger than
more?
ever. It's bigger than ever because, you know, the younger generations, not my generation, younger generations have grown up into a reality that is defined by social media, that is defined by the subjective point of view, that is defined by not having any concrete relationship with the truth. And legacy media is seen now like a tool of opposing political forces. And there's in terms of people that are reading the news or not consuming the news, or however you think about it, younger people have turned away from legacy media. You've mentioned that I teach. Every semester I ask my students, how do they consume their news? And every semester I hear TikTok and how they do not trust newspaper. And I think that legacy media needs to do a better work in demonstrating the fact that they are accountable, right? You can't just run a story in the New York Times without verifying what you're writing with at least 3 sources, right? You have a relationship with the truth in a way that does not exist on social media and non-traditional forms of communication. And I think they have a huge responsibility to lead the charge and the demand for a negation of disinformation and misinformation.
I think that that is a perfect place to stop. So I am going to thank everyone for being here
Thank you so
today.
much.
It is interesting that it's also election day. So, take that for what you will. Thank you so much to our speaker. It was an amazing program. And Dr. Rotem, I hope you have an amazing rest of your day.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much for being here and for bearing with me through this. Thank you so much.